Good evening, and thank you for joining me this evening or looking through this later. This is our third Better Way of Weekly Live. These happen every Tuesday and will be happening from about 7 o'clock in the evening. Now, this evening, what we're going to discuss is my new Better Way of Care policy. It goes without saying, adult social care, there's a huge cost involved and it affects every single council up and down the UK and also central government. There are many ways in which people try to get short term wins as such, but what we're looking at is ways where we can gain a long term win. Because if we don't start focusing on long term policy, and how we can bring the cost down over a period of time, then we're constantly going to be caught in the same loop. Prices are always rising, and it's just never going to be, sorry, along with demand, there's just never going to be a way out of it by short term wins. We do definitely need to focus on how we can tackle things on a long term perspective. Now, the first thing that I looked at, because I've looked at this in a few different ways, and I've now come up with an idea where actually it's better to do more of a hybrid system rather than it just focusing on one type of care. So, to begin with, what I looked at, what I realized, what the figures show is that emergency discharge has the highest costs involved, and it's not very efficient at all. It also means that there are people that are taking up hospital beds for far longer than what they are supposed to or what they need to. And so, what we want to do is also ensure that we are benefiting hospitals by relieving some of that pressure on beds. And then, as I was going through the policy that I originally looked at, I realized that when you come to scrutinize it, what if we didn't have 100% bed for ourselves and it was only, say, 70%? How would we and how long would it take for us to actually make the savings we plan to be making? So, this is why I then also looked at learning disabilities and the emergency side to that as well, because that also has a really high cost involved. So I'm going to break it down just a little bit more for you. So what I first looked at is where would be the best place to have this intermediate care hub? Like where would we look at it? What we realize is it needs to be near to a hospital within maybe 30 to 40 minutes. It needs to be near to main roads. So we're looking at things like the M20, the M2. And that benefits for more than one reason because if you're closer to a hospital, it doesn't take so long to transport people, but also for the workflow. We need to ensure that our workforce are able to get there easily enough. It's not so detrimental to be able to be a part of this. So Maidstone definitely turned out to be the best way to pilot it. And of course, there are other options. We have the QEQM in Margate, there's a William Harvey. So there's many places we can build upon this, but Maidstone would definitely be the place to begin. Now, the initial thought, and we have kept at the same number of beds, is 200 beds for the intermediate care. Now, when looking at the figures, turnover is normally about 8 to 12 cycles per bed per year within our care hub. We would be looking at basically a 2 to 6 week turnaround. That means that 1,600 to 2,400 people would use our services per year. When you look then at the hospital impact and the conversion, there's a 40 to 60% delay in discharge cases that occupy a hospital bed longer than is necessary. Now I'm sure many of you, along with myself, have had experiences where we've needed a hospital bed and there hasn't been availability. So what we're doing will also help with that. And then there's to break down the figures, if 1,800 people blow through, 50% of those would otherwise occupy acute beds. So that means that we'd be helping out with 900 beds. So I know that's over a year, and it might not sound like a lot in some cases, but 900 beds is 900 beds. And we realised that would be really great. But like I say at the beginning, but we also need to take into consideration for this to actually be viable and for us to save the money that we want to be saving, as well as the idea of being efficient, is looking then at the learning disability side of things as well. So this is where I then started looking at things slightly differently. So we would be looking at what's now called flexible beds. We'd be hoping for 70% occupancy and a learning disability overflow use. We're actually very close to um, a care estate, for instance, that would absorb different demand types depending on pressure, and is also a system capacity modelling used in ICS planning that this brings us closely in line with. It would make sense because a mixed use hub would help ease discharge to access, which with access beds, which would be the primary function. But then we would have step down rehabilitation beds, we would have short term respite beds, and we would have some flexible learning disability crisis stabilisation beds. Now, this helps because, I mean, learning disability placements are very, very expensive and they're crisis driven. And what's most important, and I know that the care team actually within the council are also focusing on the idea of prevention. Prevention will help drive down the need of things in a crisis. So when you're looking at the learning disability beds, but also the normal emergency discharge beds, without the price going up because it's a crisis, with us dealing with it from a preventative measure, it will definitely bring costs down and it will be a more efficient way of running things. It will also, the flexibility would ensure that we're using up empty bed waste and it will stop the crisis outsourcing costs. It obviously does make things a little bit more complex. So, like I said, when I've gone through scrutinising it and looking at it, we would need to definitely be cautious on making sure that we're compliant with the CQC. We will need to have highly specialised staff. We would need to have behaviour support expertise, obviously longer term stability, maybe even some like environmental adaptations for when we have learning disability people occupying some of those beds. It would need to be medically oriented and we'd have to have a recovery focus. So you could say that we've got a slightly more higher risk when we're trying to, in a sense, mingle the two types, but we would make sure that we are CQC um, adapted and that we we would make sure that there is no risk of inappropriate placement. So we would have to be sure that we're placing individuals in suitable short-term rehab settings. Um, there can be a high turnover of hubs, fast throughout, time limited. So it only works if we actually physically and operationally separate the two. And this is where I think that then becomes easier because although we were concerned about placements and there being that crossover, if we have designated area for the learning disability beds of the rehab area, and then we have the places for the emergency discharge, that will help separate those two areas and there won't be that initial, or there won't be so much concern involved with the placements. So the discharge beds, as I say, would be the core. It would help with the hospital discharge flow. There would be a reablement focus and it'd be quite a high turnover. You'd have another zone, so we could call zone A and zone B, for instance. We'd have the step down and rehab. That would be where you'd find things like physiotherapy, recovery, and we'd be looking at maybe a 2 to 6 week stay in that place. Then we'd have a separate zone or place, which would be zone C, and that would be for the learning disability short-term crisis stabilisation. Would be more of a smaller dedicated unit, basically. That means it wouldn't be interchangeable beds, but they'd have their own section. There'd be specialist staffing in that area. And of course, it wouldn't be for long-term care. And then we'd have Zone D, and Zone D was what I originally thought of in the um, first option of this as well, before looking at the learning disability side of things, because I think what's really important and again would help save and bring down costs and be more efficient is the sort of staffing that we're bringing in. When it comes to nursing, when it comes to the NHS, when it comes to care staff, I'm starting to feel like, and I don't know if you know yourself, if you've been to a care home or you've listened to people that go into care, it's normally their last choice. It's not something they're really wanting to do. And I want to make people more enthusiastic because let's face it, at any time in our lives, we could be needing some sort of hospital care, old age care, nursing. There could be many things that we might need. And we need to have staff and we need to have people that want to be involved, that enjoy it, that can see the benefit of doing it, that feel rewarded. And so I know that when training to become a nurse or any part of the NHS, really, there's a need for you to carry out support placements or for you to do learning, training in actual environments. So I thought, why not also have an education and training hub on site? So these would be like university placements, they would be nursing associate apprenticeships, things like physio student rotations. But there's a real need to include learning placements alongside, not, and I will specify, not to replace the staff that we would need, but for them to work alongside, for them to feel enthusiastic about what they're doing, for them to be able to say they've had the experience of working in a placement like this. And then if we look at the financial reality, for instance, the financial reality now of having a combined model, it would mean there'd be a better workforce pipeline for more long-term gain. It would reduce agency reliance. Again, agency reliance and stuff. The cost that it is just not efficient. We need to move away from agency staff. And I know from when I was in the adult social care deputy seat for a short while that one of the biggest things they spoke about was when it came to, for instance, social workers, they'd put them through training, then had to give them a choice of what they want to do. But hang on a minute, there's actually a need for them in some sections. So we should be training them and pushing them towards that. And that's the same with all of the stuff that we're taking on in that capacity. We should be thinking about where do we need them and placing them there. So, and the sooner we get on top of that, sorry, the sooner we get on top of that, the better, because again, that will help reduce costs of using agency staff. There'll be fewer emergency placements. Now, I say the word fewer because, of course, there may still be a need for some of them to go elsewhere, but there'll be a smoother discharge flow. And there would be some also crisis cost reduction from the learning disability placements. Um, of course, some people will talk about some of the financial risks. Of course, when you're having multiple care models in one site, it means a higher staff complexity. But again, in the long run, it is going to work out so much better for us. The regulatory overhead, there are capital cost increases. So when I first looked at the design to now, we'd be looking at about, I think it was about 43 million to put this together, which might sound like a lot to some, but now that we can guarantee more bed flow, so whereas in the first model, we would look at maybe only getting 70% of beds filled, which means it would take longer for us to break even, for us to then start saving the 5 million a year. Well, 3 to 5 million at that point. Now, when we look at it this way, we'll guarantee more of our beds will be filled because of the breakdown in different zones, which means that we will break even quicker and that we should be able to hit the 5.4 million savings per year then that we would be wanting to make. And 5.4 million is a lot when you think about what the budget is. And when you then also look at, for instance, when this one works, the fact that, okay, there's 3 other hospitals in Kent where they could actually be really good to also have one of these nearby. So we'd be then looking at implementing maybe a smaller version, depending on the size of the amount of discharges from those hospitals, but being able to implement a similar thing, and then again saving another, say, 3 million a year in each one of those, if they're smaller, of course. It it's something that is not just, it's something that can grow. It's something that can become more. And also, it doesn't have to just be in Kent. Obviously, I'm a Kent County Council. I want to be able to pilot it in Kent. And being the leader of Better Way of, and being in Kent, it makes sense to start it here. But when I looked at Essex, for instance, Essex runs on a very similar system to how we do. Being able to implement something like that there would also be able to make the same sort of differences. And it's something that can be used across the UK. Imagine when you then look at all of the budgets overall, being able to save that money in each area would be absolutely amazing. So what I realised, coming back to like a final assessment of what we were doing, an intermediate care and workforce development campus or hub. I prefer the word hub, to be fair. I don't want people to look at it just as cost saving, because it's not just about that. There's workforce integration, which means we've got strong long-term value. We would have flexible bed use, so there's a moderate efficiency gain. There's the learning disability mixing, which would again be so much more efficient and cost effective. What we would be looking at is the 200 beds in Kent. A cost versus saver over 10 years would sort of look like this, including the workforce training, of course. It would actually turn into a capital investment business sort of case, especially when you're looking to analyse it. So bear with me a second, because I am just, you know, it's so hot today that I could not remember this off the top of my head, even when I was trying. So I'm going to break it. So what I want to do is, I'm just figuring out now, is I want to break it down for you, so it's much easier than me just rambling on. So the proposed model: 200 bed 200 hybrid bed hub, 120 beds for hospital discharge, which is discharge to assess, 50 beds for step down rehabilitation, 20 beds for learning disability short-term crisis stabilisation, which would be in its own separate unit, 10 to 20 placements for training, education function, and they will obviously be included within staffing. So but operationally, there would be 200 beds. The facilities are not standard care homes, so they're mixed clinical social environments. The estimated capital cost would be this. You'd have the component cost main discharge and rehab units, 28 to 35 million for the learning disability unit, and then segregated 5 to 8 million for training and 1 to 2 million for the education infrastructure side of it. Then, of course, there will be some equipment and therapy spaces for about 3 to 5 million. So the total capital cost would range between 37 million to 50 million. I would average it more to 43 to 45 million. Then you've got your operating model assumption. So your average weekly cost per bed, you'd look at the type of weekly costs. The discharge beds, for instance, would be 850, rehab beds 900, learning disability crisis beds would be about £1,800, and so blended average week you'd be looking at about £1,000. The annual operating costs would look like this. You've got 200 beds times £1,000 times 52 weeks. That's 10.4 million per year. Without the campus, those 200 people would typically flow into emergency discharge placements, residential care, nursing placements, and learning disability spot purchases. Those average costs, when it comes to discharge and emergency placements, are 1,600 a week. The residential, the nursing, the learning disability average would be between 1,400 and 2,500, which is much higher. So once that's blended The avoided cost was £1,500 a week per person. So the annual cost comparison, the current system of 200 people in external placements, looking at about £1,500 a week, is £15.6 million per year. So that's what it's currently costing us. My proposed hub system would only cost 10.4 million per year. So the annual saving when it's operational would be 5.2 million per year. Now, of course, the capital cost, the 43 million to begin with, it might take a short time to pay that back. If we're being realistic, we're probably looking at about an eight-year period. But like I say, it would depend on the occupancy of the beds, and that's why I brought in this other factor. This is why it's more of a mixed use now, rather than just focusing on one type of care. We're not always going to get 100% occupancy, regardless of how we look at it. But even with the 80 to 90% occupancy, even though some would still require residential care, and even though there would be some staffing complexities when it comes to the integrated learning disability and discharge staffing, we're still saving 3 to 5.2 million a year, even if it takes more than the 8 to 9 years for us to adjust the payback. I am more than confident that with the mixed model, we would see beds filled more on an 80 to 90% rather than a 70%. I am very confident that we would pay that back within the time frame. There's a shorter time frame, but even if it takes that bit longer, it's not all about short-term wins. Like I say, for us to be more efficient, for us to start saving money properly, we want long-term gains. The cost of these placements are only going to go up, just like the cost of everything else. What it costs now is going to cost so much more in 3 to 5 years' time, let alone 10 years' time. And unless we suddenly come into a windfall of money, we can't keep affording to pay these costs. We need to start looking at systems like this. We need to bring in places where we can be more efficient, but also bring the cost down, but also at the same time help the hospitals. The need, the supply, the demand on hospital beds is going to keep on increasing as well. So if we're not thinking about all of these things and putting things in place to help combat them all, then we're just going to keep going around in this vicious cycle. And we're never, ever going to be in a position where we have a better quality of life and where we're being able to provide a better quality of care. The looking at where the real value actually comes from, it's not, like I say, it's not just about finances. The model, I mean, the system benefits, look at the system benefits. Faster hospital discharge, it reduces the pressure on the NHS. One of the most crucial things that we need is to be able to get appointments when we need and to be seen when we need to. How long do some people have to wait in A&E? And I've been there. I've been there with my son when he had his appendix out a few years ago. Not a great experience. The staff were lovely, bless them, not their fault, but the mismanagement in there was shocking. Reduce emergency placement volatility. There'll be improved patient flow stability, reduce reliance on high-cost spot purchasing, and workforce training pipeline. So it helps with a long-term supply benefit. And like I said at the beginning, it's so important to get people wanting to be involved in care and helping there be ways in which they can put what they're learning to use. It also reduces exposure to private provider price shocks. Again, like I said, when we're relying on agency staff or when we're relying on suddenly need to use a private bed, the costs are going to be so much more. And it creates local controlled capacity buffer. The double running risk. Now, like I said, there will still be some need for emergency placements, but there won't be as many. So even when they look at that, we're going to be saving the majority of those. We can't save all of them because there is still a need in that way. But the mixed use complexity um, risk is when you look at this as CQC compliance, we can align ourselves with CQC. We can make sure that they advise us on the best ways of going forward. We can make sure we have safeguarding requirements. Like I say, we will split this into zones, different zones. The learning disability zone will have its own unit to work from. The staffing in there will be as required. We will have a separation of care models, but they will be well maintained because everyone will know what zone is for what. So although some of them may look at a mixed use complexity and think, oh, well, what about the risk of this or the risk of that? So long as we have things broken down in different zones, so long as we know what's needed where, then we will be able to get past any risk. And again, even with everything you do, there is a risk. There's always a small risk involved, but it's how you manage that, it's how you look at that and move forwards with it to make it better. And that's what we're all about. So our model will be a credible long-term system and basically an investment, because again, it's going to bring down the high cost emergency care. It's going to be stable in its discharge flow. It will improve the workforce pipeline and it will create controlled capacity. We will save Kent £3 to £5 million per year with an 8 to 9 year payback, and will reduce the system inability and emergency placement dependency. Not just cutting the costs, but we are making a difference to hospitals. We are making a difference to emergency placements, and we're being efficient. So that is the policy in a nutshell. Sorry for me pausing at one point and jumping between what I was trying to read here, but like I say, it is a hot day today, and definitely noticing that. But I hope that does make sense to you. And of course, there's a lot more um, sort of involved here, but I don't need to read everything to you. It will just complicate things more. What I was hoping to do was to sort of share with you some of the main points, show you why it's so important, show you how looking at long-term investments and looking at ways to be efficient long-term. Okay, it won't give us that, oh, look what we've done that are in like the first year. But what it does is it sets us up so that it doesn't matter if in 10 years' time someone else is in. We've put something in place where they can then go, this has now saved us this much money this year. We can knock this off of our budget. We can put that money elsewhere, invest it in other areas where it's needed. And we need to do this throughout, not even just in adult social care. We need to look at all things. We need to look at long term effects and visions, and change things so that it's not about the short term win. It's not about shouting about what you've managed to do just within the year. Look at what you're doing long term, actually make a difference to people's lives. That is what we are going to do. It's what we want to do. That's what Better Way Of is about, creating a better quality of life. We want to see people living better. We want to see our county and eventually our country thriving. We want to see progress. We want to see everybody being able to experience things in the best possible way. And there are ways of managing things more efficiently. There are ways of cutting costs that do not actually mean cutting a service, but like with this, just changing how it's done. And I think it's really important that people start to look at that. And I was very quickly going to go through one of the questions I got asked from last week's live feed. And the reason I've picked this is because it's not the first person to state this to me. And I'm also hoping that it helps me then to paint a picture of myself a bit more to you. So this person has said, literally put a statement out there. What has happened to you? You've gone from being this caring person who used to help people through different things in life. And the reason that they say that is because of the counseling work I used to do and things, to now being involved in politics. To them, they couldn't see the linking. So I really want to explain this. I want to explain this so that you can understand it too. I spent a lot of time helping people with intermediate issues. So they've broken up with somebody, or somebody's walked out on them. They're going through a bereavement. They've been diagnosed with something, and it's hard to then have to deal with what you've been diagnosed with, the effects it's going to have on your life. family issues, job issues. I've helped a lot of people in different ways, and I absolutely loved doing that. But it dawned on me that although these were the things that were predominantly in people's minds, and these were things that day to day were running through their heads and causing them distress and many other things, in the background, they'd always come back and go, "Oh, my God, goodness, it's gone up again in price. You know how hard it is to get a weekly shopping and all this." And I realized that no matter how much I helped everybody with their day to day, what they thought were priorities, what about these other issues in life, the bigger issues that I can't help with unless I'm in a position of power? And what I really wanted to achieve for everybody, even when doing that, was to help them have a better life, help them feel like they were getting somewhere better. And so I realized that being in politics is no different if you're going into it from that same perspective and level of care. For me, when I made that change, it made sense to me because how can I help people the most? I can sit here all day and listen to people's issues and guide them, support them, but I can never change the cost of living crisis, change the care that they receive, change the education their children receive, change the safety on our streets. I can't do any of that just by talking to someone. I have to get into power to help them with those issues. And once I help them with those issues, it also has a knock on effect to their ability to deal with other issues in life. So to me, it made perfect sense. Politics is not just about shouting about one thing or another. If you really are in politics for the right reasons, you're in politics because you care. You're in politics because you want to see better happening. You want to do better. You want people to be able to have a better life. That is why I made that switch. And I hope that that helps you to see a little bit more about me. And I know there's people out there that be like, oh, but we've seen you do this, and oh, we've seen you do that. You know what? We've all done things. We've all got involved with things. We've all been passionate about things. And sometimes you have to see things from different angles to be able to then have a very balanced perspective. And that's where we're at. When I founded the party, it is from a balanced perspective. It's because I can see on many different levels what affects people's day to day lives, what affects people's minds the most, what affects people's emotional and mental well being. I can see all of that. And I understand the need to create a safer, better place for people. Anyway, um, I probably answered that a bit more passionately than I thought. I was going to try and hold back a little bit, but there we go. So thank you so much for joining me. Thank you so much if you're looking at this now later on. If you have any questions, please do email me with your question, and I will look to answering one of them next week. And then next week we'll either look at another policy, or if something else comes up, then we'll have a look at whatever that might be. A lot happens in politics in just a day, let alone a week. But take care, have a lovely evening. Please stay hydrated. I'm learning that issue myself. But have a lovely rest of your week and take care.